David had always considered his neighborhood a calm and pleasant place to live. The streets were lined with tall trees that provided shade in the summer and a touch of color in the fall. Children played safely on the sidewalks, and most of the neighbors greeted one another with friendly smiles. It was the kind of place where people felt proud of their homes. But like any neighborhood, it had one person who stood out for the wrong reasons. That person was Karen, the head of the Homeowners Association. She was known for keeping a close eye on everything. She often left notes about lawns being too long or trash cans being left outside too long. Some neighbors thought she cared too much, while others just avoided her. David had tried to stay neutral, but over time, he too grew tired of her constant complaints and controlling attitude. One late evening, as the sky darkened and most houses glowed softly with warm lights inside, David sat in his living room reading a book. The day had been quiet, and he was ready to relax before going to bed. Suddenly, a faint sound reached his ears. At first, it was so soft that he thought it might have been the wind brushing against the side of the house. But then he heard it again, this time sharper and louder, like a clink of metal or a shuffle of movement. David frowned and set his book down. The sound was coming from his garage. He paused for a moment, listening carefully. His garage was attached to the side of his house, and he knew it should have been locked. He rose slowly from his chair, trying not to make noise, and walked toward the door that led to the garage. His heart started to beat faster as the sound repeated, now clearly the noise of something or someone moving around inside. He reached for the doorknob and stopped himself. If someone really was inside, barging in recklessly might not be safe. He considered calling the police right away, but then thought it could be something harmless like a raccoon that had slipped in through a small gap. Wanting to be careful, he decided to grab a flashlight first. He opened the kitchen drawer quietly and pulled out the heavy black flashlight he kept there for emergencies. Taking a deep breath, David slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. The garage light was off, leaving the room in shadows. He pressed the flashlight button and the beam cut through the darkness. His eyes scanned across the floor, moving from one corner to another. That was when he saw it. Tools were scattered on the ground, boxes pushed aside, and in the corner near the shelves there was movement. David lifted the flashlight higher, and the beam landed on a young figure crouched near the shelves. It was not an animal. It was a teenage boy with a backpack, his hands full of tools and small equipment. The boy froze as the light caught his face. For a moment, silence filled the air. David blinked in disbelief. He recognized the boy immediately. It was Karen's son. The boy looked shocked, caught in the act. His eyes darted from the flashlight to the door as if calculating how to escape. David's voice came out steady but firm. "What are you doing in my garage?" he asked. The boy stammered. I was just borrowing some stuff." "I didn't mean anything bad." David shook his head. "This is not borrowing. You broke into my garage." The boy's face turned pale. He shifted nervously and tried to stand. But in his rush, he knocked over a box of paint cans stacked near the wall. The cans rolled across the floor with a loud clatter, echoing through the garage. David stepped back quickly to avoid the mess, keeping the flashlight focused on him. "You need to stop right now," David said, his voice calm but firm. "Put everything down." The boy hesitated, his hands trembling as he held onto the backpack straps. The garage smelled faintly of paint and dust now that the cans had spilled. David noticed that the boy's backpack already looked heavy, likely filled with things he had taken from the shelves. David's mind raced. He knew this was not a small mistake. This was a serious act, and the boy was clearly caught in the middle of it. He also knew that dealing with Karen would be even more difficult than dealing with her son. She never admitted to being wrong about anything, and she defended her family fiercely, often ignoring the truth. But at this moment, the situation was not about Karen's personality. It was about the fact that someone had broken into his garage, and he had caught them in the act. David lowered the flashlight slightly, but kept it pointed close enough to remind the boy that he was being watched. He pulled out his phone and considered calling the police immediately. But before he could dial, the boy suddenly made a move toward the side door of the garage. "Wait," David said loudly. "Don't run." The boy froze again, breathing hard. His nervousness filled the room. It was clear he was not a hardened troublemaker. He was just a teenager who thought he could get away with something he should not have done. But that did not excuse his actions. At that moment, David heard footsteps outside. Someone was approaching quickly. The sound of heels clicking against the driveway made it clear who it was before he even saw her. Karen's voice rang out from the darkness outside the garage. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her tone sharp and accusing. David felt a wave of frustration. Of course Karen had arrived. He turned his head slightly as she appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed and her face full of suspicion. When her eyes landed on her son, caught red-handed in the middle of the mess, her expression shifted from surprise to anger, not at her son but at David. "What are you doing with my child?" she shouted. "Why are you scaring him like this?" David could hardly believe what he was hearing. He gestured toward the broken lock on the garage door and the scattered tools. "Karen," he said firmly, "I found your son inside my garage. He broke in and he was taking my things." Karen gasped, but not in the way David expected. Instead of acknowledging the truth, she stepped in front of her son, shielding him from the beam of the flashlight. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "He was only borrowing something. You're making it sound like a crime." David's patience thinned. "Your son broke my lock. That is not borrowing. That is trespassing and stealing." Karen's son shifted uneasily behind her, his guilt written across his face. He clutched his backpack tighter, as if hoping the items inside would remain unnoticed. Karen, however, raised her chin and glared at David. "You always exaggerate. You've never liked me, and now you're targeting my family." The situation was spinning into an argument David knew too well. Karen's tactic was always the same: deny, deflect, and blame others. But this time the evidence was clear. The broken lock, the scattered tools, the backpack filled with his belongings. David realized this was not a problem he could handle alone. As much as he disliked unnecessary conflict, the boy's actions and Karen's refusal to admit the truth left him with no choice. He would need to call the police. His hand tightened on his phone as he prepared to make the call. The night that had started peacefully had turned into something far more serious. And this was only the beginning. The cold night air surrounded the open garage as tension filled the space. David stood with his phone in one hand and his flashlight in the other, while Karen blocked her son from view as if protecting him from danger. The boy, still holding his backpack tightly, lowered his head and shifted nervously behind her. The broken lock hung loosely from the garage door, swaying slightly as a reminder of what had happened. David spoke with calm authority. "Karen, this cannot be ignored. Your son broke into my garage. That is not borrowing. That is breaking the law." Karen's eyes narrowed, her voice sharp. "You are overreacting. He is just a boy. He made a small mistake. You want to ruin his future over a few tools?" David pointed toward the shelves. "A mistake is forgetting to return something. This is not a mistake." He forced his way inside. "Look at the lock. Look at the mess." The neighbors had started to notice the commotion. Curtains shifted as people peeked out from their windows. A porch light flicked on across the street. David knew the situation was no longer private. Karen straightened her shoulders and crossed her arms tightly. "You do not need to call anyone. I will handle this myself. Give me a chance to talk to him and he will return everything." David shook his head slowly. "It is not about the things. It is about the act. If I let this go, what stops him from doing it again? What if he chooses another neighbor's house next time?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned slightly toward her son and whispered something, but David caught a few words. "Stay quiet. Let me deal with this." The boy glanced at David, then back at his mother. His face was pale, his expression heavy with guilt. He seemed torn between admitting the truth and hiding behind his mother's protection. David took a deep breath, trying to steady his emotions. He did not want an argument. He wanted fairness. "Karen, I am giving you the chance to take responsibility. But if you refuse, then I have no choice but to call the police." The boy finally spoke, his voice trembling. "Mom, I should just give it back." He caught me. "I should not have done it," Karen snapped at him quickly. "Quiet, you do not understand. People like him want to make us look bad. You do not say anything." David was taken aback by her words. "People like me?" "Karen, this is not about me. This is about what your son did. Stop making excuses." The boy's shoulders slumped as he slowly lowered the backpack to the floor. The sound of it hitting the ground echoed in the garage. Something metallic clinked inside, confirming that tools and other items had already been packed. Karen's face reddened with anger. "You are embarrassing me," she whispered harshly at her son. Then, louder, she directed her fury at David. "This is your fault. You are twisting everything. If you had simply left your garage better secured, this would not have happened." David blinked in disbelief. She had turned the blame onto him. "My garage was locked. The lock is broken now because he forced it open. How is that my fault?" The argument grew louder, and now more neighbors had stepped onto their porches. Some whispered to each other, while others simply watched silently. The neighborhood had always known Karen could be difficult, but few had seen her in a moment like this. David knew he could not waste more time. He opened his phone and began to dial the non-emergency police number. Karen's eyes widened as she realized what he was doing. She reached forward as if to stop him, but he stepped back quickly. "You cannot do this," Karen said desperately. "He is my son. He will have this on his record. Do you really want to destroy his life over something small?" David's voice was steady but filled with firm resolve. "I am not destroying his life. I am holding him accountable. He needs to learn that actions have consequences. If you protect him from the truth now, he will only go down a worse path later." Karen's son lowered his head again. His hands twisted nervously as he stood silently behind his mother. He did not argue anymore. He knew he was caught. The phone rang and David spoke clearly to the operator. He explained the situation in simple words. There was a break-in. The suspect was still present, and the suspect was the son of his neighbor. The operator promised officers would arrive soon. Karen's face twisted in frustration. She paced near the garage door, muttering under her breath about unfair treatment and nosy neighbors. Every few seconds she turned to glare at David as if he were the villain in the story. Minutes felt like hours, but soon the distant hum of a police car grew louder. Blue and red lights lit up the street as a patrol car pulled up in front of David's house. 2 officers stepped out, their uniforms neat and their expressions professional. The neighbors who had gathered outside grew silent, watching carefully. The officers approached the garage. One of them, a tall man with a calm voice, spoke first. "Good evening. We received a report of a break-in. Can someone explain what happened?" David gestured toward the broken lock and the boy. "Officer, I caught him inside my garage. He was taking my belongings. This is not the first time I have had to deal with problems from this family, but tonight it went too far. I need help." Karen stepped forward quickly, her voice raised. "This is blown out of proportion. He is just a boy. He made a mistake. We can handle it privately. There is no need for this." The second officer, a woman with a steady gaze, looked at the boy. "Son, is that true? Were you inside his garage without permission?" The boy hesitated, his eyes flicking toward his mother, then to the officers. He opened his mouth but did not speak. His silence was louder than words. The female officer nodded. "Please open the backpack." The boy slowly bent down and unzipped it. Inside were several tools, a small power drill and other equipment that clearly did not belong to him. The officers exchanged glances, then looked at Karen. "Ma'am," the tall officer said, "this is not a small mistake. This is theft and unlawful entry. We understand he is young, but this is serious." Karen's voice cracked with emotion. "Please, you cannot take him. He is my only child. He has school. He is not a criminal." The officer remained calm. No one is calling him a hardened criminal, but breaking into a neighbor's garage is a crime. He needs to face the consequences. That is how people learn and grow. Karen's son finally spoke in a low voice. "I am sorry. I should not have done it. I just wanted some tools. I thought I could sneak in and out. I was wrong." The words hung in the air. For the first time, the truth had been spoken directly by him. David felt a small sense of relief, but the seriousness of the moment still weighed heavily on everyone. The officers carefully guided the boy out of the garage. One of them took his arm gently but firmly. Karen tried to step in the way, but the female officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, please step aside. This is procedure. You can come to the station later." Karen's face crumpled with anger and helplessness. She shouted about unfair treatment, but her words were drowned out by the flashing lights and the quiet strength of the officer's presence. The boy was escorted toward the patrol car. The neighbors whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others watching with wide eyes. David stood silently in the garage, his heart heavy but steady. He had not wanted things to reach this point, but he knew it was the only way forward. Allowing the boy to walk free without accountability would have been worse in the long run. As the patrol car doors closed and the boy sat inside, the officers turned back to David to take his statement. Karen stood on the curb, her arms crossed tightly. Her eyes filled with fury and humiliation. For once, her voice held no power. This was the moment when the neighborhood realized that even the loudest voice could not silence the truth, and David knew this night was only the beginning of a larger change. The night grew quiet again once the patrol car drove away. The flashing red and blue lights faded down the street, leaving only the soft glow of porch lamps and the cool air of the evening. Neighbors who had gathered slowly stepped back inside their homes, though many whispered to each other before shutting their doors. Everyone had witnessed what happened. Everyone had seen Karen's son taken away in handcuffs. David stood in his garage looking at the broken lock and the scattered mess of tools on the floor. He felt tired but steady. He had done what he believed was right. Yet he also knew this incident was going to ripple through the neighborhood. Karen was not the kind of person to let something go quietly. As he bent down to gather the spilled paint cans and put them back in place, his mind replayed the scene. The boy's pale face, the backpack full of stolen items, Karen's shouting, and the calm but firm voices of the police officers. It all felt unreal, like a scene from a story rather than real life. He carried the paint cans to the shelf one by one. The smell of paint still hung in the air. As he worked, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from his neighbor across the street, an older man named Paul. "Good job standing your ground," the message read. "You did the right thing." David gave a small nod to himself. At least some of the neighbors understood. He locked the interior door to the garage carefully and went inside, determined to get some rest. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with whispers. News traveled quickly in quiet communities, and by sunrise, nearly everyone knew about the incident. Some people walked their dogs a little slower near David's house, as if hoping to see or hear more. Others pretended nothing had happened, though their curious eyes gave them away. At the local coffee shop down the road, two neighbors sat together at a corner table, their voices low but their words clear. "Can you believe it? Karen's son caught stealing right out of David's garage. I always thought that boy was trouble. He roams the streets at night. I am not surprised. What do you think Karen will do now? You know she never admits to being wrong. She will probably blame David. She always blames somebody else." The whispers continued throughout the day. By afternoon, nearly every household had chosen a side. Those who quietly supported David for standing firm, and those who worried Karen's anger would make the neighborhood tense for weeks. David tried to go about his day normally. He worked on his computer, prepared lunch, and even stepped outside to water the small garden in his yard. But he could feel the weight of attention on him. A neighbor walking by with a stroller gave him a supportive smile, while another simply stared at him without a word. As he finished watering, he noticed Karen across the street. She stood on her porch with her arms crossed, staring at him with a storm in her eyes. Her lips were pressed tight and she did not move, almost as if she wanted him to see her anger. David looked back for only a second before turning calmly and walking inside. He refused to play her games. Later that evening, Paul knocked on David's door. The older man carried a friendly smile and 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you could use this," Paul said warmly, handing 1 cup over. David thanked him and invited him inside. They sat at the small dining table, sipping the hot drinks. "You did the right thing," Paul said again. "Everyone saw what happened. No one can deny the truth. But Karen will not let this go easily," David sighed. "I know. I have dealt with her for years, but this feels different. She is angry and embarrassed. She will try to turn the story around." Paul nodded. "She already has. I overheard her this morning telling someone that you set her son up. She claims you left your garage unlocked on purpose to trap him." David shook his head in disbelief. "That is nonsense. The police saw the broken lock. They saw everything." Paul leaned back in his chair. "True, but Karen has a way of twisting things. Be ready, David. She may not win the truth, but she will fight with words." David appreciated the warning. He knew Paul was right. The following day, the first sign of Karen's retaliation appeared. A printed notice was taped to the community board near the park entrance. It was unsigned, but the bold letters made it clear who had written it. "Neighbors, beware of false accusations. Some people in our community are quick to call the police instead of solving problems like adults. This creates unnecessary tension and harms our children. We should protect our families, not drag them into the system for small mistakes." The message ended with a call for neighbors to Stand together against unfair treatment. Several people read the note as they passed by. Some nodded in agreement while others shook their heads. David himself saw it during his evening walk. He pulled the notice off the board and folded it in his hand. He did not want the words to poison the atmosphere even further, though he knew many had already read them. That night, as he sat in his living room, David reflected on Karen's behavior. She had chosen to defend her son by attacking him, the victim. Instead of teaching her son responsibility, she had doubled down on excuses. David knew he had to be careful. He could not let her lies spread unchecked. At the same time, he did not want to be drawn into endless arguments. The truth was on his side, and many neighbors had witnessed it. But Karen was loud, and sometimes a loud voice could drown out reason. A few days later, the police returned to the neighborhood, not with sirens, but with a simple knock on David's door. The same officers who had responded earlier came to collect a formal statement. The female officer spoke kindly. "We need you to describe exactly what happened for our report. It will help the court decide the next steps for the boy." David calmly explained everything again, from the first strange sound he heard in the garage to the moment the patrol car left with Karen's son inside. The officers listened carefully, writing notes. When he finished, the tall officer nodded. "You did the right thing, Mr. David. It is not easy to stand firm when neighbors are involved, but your actions were correct. This will give the boy a chance to understand the seriousness of his choices." David thanked them for their work. After they left, he felt a sense of quiet pride. He had not backed down, and he had handled the matter with honesty. Karen, however, was not finished. That same evening, she walked door to door speaking with neighbors. She carried a stack of papers in her hand. Each page was a petition, asking the HOA to review David's behavior. She claimed he had caused unnecessary distress to the community by involving the police. Some neighbors signed out of fear or politeness. Others refused and closed their doors. When Karen finally knocked on Paul's door, the older man gave her a sharp look. "Karen, your son broke into David's garage. You should be apologizing, not blaming him," Karen bristled. "He is exaggerating. My boy is not a criminal. David is turning everyone against us." Paul's voice grew firm. "No, Karen, your son turned people against himself by stealing, and you are making it worse by refusing to face the truth." He closed the door before she could respond. Word spread quickly about the petition. Some neighbors rolled their eyes, others laughed, and a few worried it would stir more trouble. David himself heard about it when a neighbor stopped by to warn him. "She is trying to get you removed from the HOA board meetings," the neighbor explained. "But do not worry. Most of us know the truth. We saw it with our own eyes." David thanked them and kept calm. He refused to argue publicly. He trusted that the truth would stand stronger than Karen's lies. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had changed. Where once Karen's voice had been the loudest, now more people were speaking openly. They talked about fairness, about responsibility, and about how important it was to protect their community from dishonesty. Some neighbors who had once feared Karen now felt braver. They realized she could not control the story forever. As David stood outside one evening, watering his garden again, several neighbors waved at him. Their smiles were genuine, their voices kind. For the first time in a long while, David felt a sense of unity in the community. Karen, standing on her porch as always, noticed it too. Her expression was tight with frustration. She was losing her grip on the neighborhood, and David knew this was only the middle of the story. The hardest parts were still ahead. The days passed slowly after the night of the break-in. The neighborhood no longer felt as peaceful as before. While most people continued their daily routines, there was a quiet tension in the air. Some neighbors avoided talking about what had happened, while others whispered about it every chance they got. David tried to live as normally as possible. He still watered his plants, read his books, and kept his house tidy. Yet he could not ignore the eyes that followed him whenever he walked down the street. Some of those eyes carried respect, but others carried suspicion. Thanks to the stories Karen had been spreading, Karen was on a mission. She wanted to turn the entire neighborhood against David. She continued her door-to-door campaign, claiming he had gone too far by involving the police. She called him a man who lacked compassion, someone who wanted to destroy a boy's future. But the more she spoke, the more people grew tired of her words. Her son had broken into the garage and everyone knew it. Pretending otherwise only made her seem unreasonable. Still, Her voice was loud, and she refused to be silent. One Saturday afternoon, the Homeowners Association held its regular meeting at the community hall. The room was simple, with folding chairs arranged in neat rows and a long table at the front for the board members. Usually these meetings were calm discussions about lawn care, parking rules, and community events. This time, however, everyone knew the air would be different. David arrived quietly and took a seat near the middle. Paul sat beside him for support, giving him a reassuring nod. At the front, Karen stood tall, her papers stacked neatly in front of her. She wore a determined expression, as though she had already won whatever battle she was about to start. The meeting began with routine matters, maintenance updates, budget discussions, and plans for a neighborhood picnic. But as soon as the floor opened for community concerns, Karen shot to her feet. "I have something to say," she announced loudly. The room fell quiet. All eyes turned toward her. "My son was unfairly treated last week," she declared. "He made a mistake, yes, but instead of showing understanding, our neighbor David chose to humiliate him by calling the police. That was unnecessary and harmful. We are supposed to be a community that supports one another, not one that destroys our children over small errors." Murmurs filled the room. Some nodded politely while others frowned. David sat still, his face calm. He knew she would twist the story. Karen continued, her voice growing stronger. "I propose that we set stricter guidelines on how neighbors handle disputes. No one should be allowed to involve the police unless every other option has been tried. We should talk to each other first, like decent people." She placed her petition on the table with a dramatic motion, as though it were a powerful piece of evidence. The chairperson of the meeting, an elderly woman named Mrs. Clark, cleared her throat. "Thank you, Karen. Does anyone else wish to speak on this matter?" Paul stood up immediately. His voice was steady and respectful. "Yes, I do. With all due respect, Karen is leaving out the truth. Her son did not simply make a small mistake. He broke into David's garage. He broke the lock and tried to steal things. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a crime. David did what any responsible person would do. He called the police. It was the right thing to do, not just for him, but for all of us." The room filled with quiet gasps. People looked at each other, some nodding, some whispering. Karen's face turned red. "That is not true. You are exaggerating just like him." She pointed at David. "He has always been against me. He wants to ruin my reputation." This time, David rose to his feet. His voice was calm, not angry. "I do not want to ruin anyone's reputation. I only want fairness. I caught your son in my garage with a backpack full of my belongings. The police saw it themselves. They saw the broken lock. They saw everything. You can say I am exaggerating, but the truth is clear. Your son chose to do something wrong, and now he must face the result of that choice." The room grew silent again. Mrs. Clark spoke softly. "We all want to protect our children, Karen, but protecting them does not mean excusing their actions. It means teaching them to take responsibility. If we ignore wrongdoing, we do not help them grow. We harm them." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. She sat down heavily, her papers crumpling under her hand. The rest of the meeting continued, but the energy in the room had shifted. Neighbors whispered quietly, most leaning toward David's side now. By the end of the evening, the petition Karen had pushed forward had gained very little support. Only 2 people had signed it, and both looked uncomfortable as they left. David walked home with Paul, who clapped him on the shoulder. "You handled yourself perfectly. Calm, honest, and strong. People respect that." David smiled faintly. "Thank you, Paul. I just hope this helps the neighborhood heal. I do not want to live in constant tension." Paul nodded. "It will take time, but truth always stands taller than lies." Karen, however, was not finished. Though her petition had failed, she continued to glare at David whenever their paths crossed. Her son had returned home after a short stay at the juvenile center, quieter and more withdrawn than before. He rarely left the house, and when he did, he kept his eyes down. Some neighbors felt sorry for him. They could see he was struggling, caught between his own guilt and his mother's endless excuses. One afternoon, David was fixing his garden fence when he noticed the boy standing at the edge of the yard. The teenager looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot. David set down his hammer and approached slowly. "Do you need something?" he asked gently. The boy hesitated, then said quietly, "I am sorry." David studied his face. The apology was soft but real. I should not have gone into your garage, the boy continued. I thought it would be easy and I thought no one would know. But I was wrong. I made everything worse. I am sorry. David felt a wave of relief. At last the boy himself was admitting the truth. Thank you for saying that, David replied kindly. What matters now is that you learn from it. Everyone makes mistakes, but what you do after matters most. The boy nodded slowly. I will not do it again. Good, David said, giving him a reassuring nod. I believe you can change. But you must be honest with yourself and others. The boy looked grateful and then walked back toward his house. From the porch, Karen had been watching. Her face was unreadable, but her arms were crossed tightly. She said nothing, only turned and went inside. The weeks that followed showed a small but clear change in the neighborhood. More people began to greet David with open kindness while Karen's influence weakened. Her loud words carried less weight now, because too many had seen the truth with their own eyes. The boy kept mostly to himself, but whenever he crossed paths with David, he gave a quiet nod of respect. It was not friendship, but it was progress. Karen remained bitter, but her power had slipped away. David, meanwhile, felt lighter. He knew the story was not over yet. There would still be challenges, still be whispers, still be moments of tension. But he also knew that he had done the right thing, and that gave him strength. The night of the break-in had tested him. The days that followed had tested the neighborhood. But slowly, step by step, fairness was winning. And deep down, David sensed that the final chapter of this story was drawing closer. The weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood slowly regained a sense of calm. The memory of the night when Karen's son broke into David's garage was still fresh, but it no longer controlled every conversation. Life moved on, but the cracks in the community were still visible. Some wounds heal slowly, especially when pride refuses to let go. David kept himself busy with his usual routines. He trimmed his hedges, kept his garage organized, and worked on small projects around the house. His neighbors respected him more than ever. Many stopped to greet him warmly, some even offering to help with his chores. It was clear that his calm strength had left an impression. But Karen had not changed. She continued to glare at David whenever their eyes met. Her voice was softer in public now, since her petition had failed. But behind closed doors, she still told anyone who would listen that David was the enemy. Her son, however, was changing. The boy was quieter, more thoughtful. He had begun attending a youth program in town, one that focused on rebuilding trust and giving young people a chance to learn new skills. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it was no longer a forced grin. It carried something real, something hopeful. One Sunday morning, the community gathered for a neighborhood cleanup. It was an annual event where families picked up trash, planted flowers, and painted fences. For many years, David had joined, enjoying the chance to work side by side with his neighbors. This time, however, he felt unsure. He knew Karen would be there, and he wondered whether his presence would spark another conflict. Still, he believed in doing his part. So he picked up his gloves, grabbed a trash bag, and walked to the park where everyone had gathered. The park buzzed with energy. Children ran around with small bags, proudly collecting candy wrappers and bottle caps. Adults raked leaves and trimmed bushes. Paul waved from across the field, calling David over. As David joined in, he noticed Karen standing with her son near the edge of the group. She was holding a rake but barely using it, her eyes darting often in his direction. Her son, however, was working quietly, pulling weeds along the path. At one point, the boy looked up and gave David a small nod. David returned it with a calm smile. That silent exchange said more than words could. It was a sign of respect and perhaps the beginning of understanding. Later in the day, when most of the work was done, Mrs. Clark gathered everyone together. The elderly woman raised her voice enough to carry over the chatter. I want to thank you all for your hard work today, she said warmly. Our park looks brighter because of you. And I want to remind everyone that a neighborhood is more than houses and fences. It is trust. It is respect. It is fairness. She paused, looking around the circle of faces. We have had difficult times recently, but I believe we are stronger when we face them together. Let us choose kindness, but let us also choose honesty. Her words touched many hearts. People clapped politely, some even smiling with a sense of relief. David noticed Karen's son listening closely, his expression thoughtful. But Karen herself folded her arms tightly, refusing to show any reaction. That evening, David sat on his porch enjoying the cool breeze. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. For the first time in many weeks, he felt truly at peace. Suddenly, he heard footsteps on his driveway. He looked up and saw Karen's son standing there holding something in his hands. David stood and approached. "Good evening," he said gently. The boy held out a small wooden box. It looked handmade, rough around the edges but carefully put together. "I made this in the youth program," the boy explained. His voice was quiet but steady. "They taught us how to work with wood. I wanted to give it to you. For your garage." David took the box, touched by the gesture. It was simple but meaningful. "Thank you," he said warmly. "I will use it." "You should be proud of this work," the boy nodded. For a moment he hesitated, then added, "I am really sorry for what I did. I know I cannot change it, but I want to do better." David placed a hand on his shoulder. "I believe you will. Remember, it is not about never making mistakes. It is about learning from them." The boy gave a faint smile and then walked away. From across the street, Karen had been watching. She stepped forward quickly, pulling her son by the arm. Her eyes burned with anger as she looked at David. "Do not try to turn him against me," she snapped. David's voice was calm. "I am not turning him against you. I am encouraging him to grow. That is what he needs." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but her son gently pulled his arm free. "Mom," he said softly, "he is right. I need to change." Karen froze. She stared at her son as if she could not believe the words had come from him. For the first time, she had no answer. She turned quickly and walked back to her house, leaving her son behind for a moment before he followed. In the weeks that followed, the change in the boy became more visible. He helped his mother with groceries, offered to mow the lawn for neighbors, and even joined a local sports team. People began to notice his effort, and slowly, their whispers about him turned from judgment to cautious praise. Karen, however, struggled. She continued to live in the shadow of her pride, unable to admit openly that her son had done wrong. But she could not stop the world from seeing what was plain. Her son was trying, and David had been right to stand firm. One evening, Mrs. Clark visited David. She sat with him on the porch, sipping tea. "You know," she said, "this neighborhood owes you thanks. You stood for what was right when it was not easy. If you had stayed silent, things would have only gotten worse." David shook his head humbly. "I only did what anyone should do." Mrs. Clark smiled. "Perhaps, but few people do it with the calmness and fairness that you showed. That is why people respect you now. And that is why this neighborhood will heal." The final turning point came one afternoon when the police officer who had handled the case returned to the neighborhood for a follow-up. He spoke with several families, checking on how the boy was adjusting after his release. The officer later told David privately, "I have seen many young people go down the wrong path and never look back. But your neighbor's son is different. He has potential. He is trying. I think your response played a big part in that." David listened quietly, grateful for the words. The story that had once divided the neighborhood now began to fade into the background. People no longer spoke of it with anger or fear. Instead, they spoke of it as a lesson, a reminder that fairness mattered, that honesty mattered, and that even mistakes could become opportunities for growth. Karen never offered David an apology. Perhaps she never would, but her son's quiet efforts spoke louder than her silence ever could. As for David, he felt content. He had protected what was his, stood by the truth, and still offered a chance for change. That balance, he knew, was the heart of justice. On a warm summer evening, David stood once more in front of his garage. He placed the small wooden box, the gift from Karen's son, on a shelf inside. Every time he looked at it, he remembered not just the night of the break-in, but everything that followed: the fear, the conflict, the hard words, and the slow, steady journey toward healing. The garage was quiet now, but in David's heart, the memory spoke clearly. Sometimes doing the right thing means standing firm even when others misunderstand. And sometimes the right thing leaves a mark not only on yourself but on those around you. For the neighborhood, the story had ended. For Karen's son, a new story had begun. And for David, life had returned to peace, peace earned through truth, patience, and the courage to stand tall.